someone who has epilepsy or a seizure disorder? Today, we are going to learn about a resource to help support people managing this. Hello, and thank you for joining today's session in the Connecting Our Community Speaker Series. The goal of the series is to provide resources to the disability community. These sessions are offered on the fourth Wednesday of every month at 11:45 a.m. Eastern Time. My name is Christine Brookins. For those who are not familiar with me, I will let you know that I am both a parent and a professional dedicated to serving the disability community. And because of this, I found it outspoken to give a voice to those who may not be heard. Each month, we speak with experts in fields relevant to this community, and I am always open to suggestions for topics about which you would like to learn. But today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Peggy Beem Jelley, who is the president and CEO of the Epilepsy Association of Western and Central Pennsylvania, otherwise referred to as EAWCP. Peggy has been with the association since 1993. She assumed her role in executive leadership in 2014. As president and CEO, Peggy oversees all aspects of EAWCP activities, including administration of all programs, fundraising, and public policy advocacy. Peggy is a graduate of Seton Hill College. Prior to joining the staff of the EAWCP, Peggy worked with a number of community residential providers serving people with disabilities. Peggy also worked with members of both the State House of Representatives and the U.S. Congress earlier in her career. Peggy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
I'm sure we're going to learn a lot today, so we'll dive in. And if I can, to kind of set the stage, would you mind telling our audience what is epilepsy?
Sure. Let me start first by letting everybody know that I am not a medical professional. So I kind of want to put the disclaimer out there that I'm not a medical professional and that what we're doing today is not giving medical advice. But a lot of folks do come to the Epilepsy Association for education about epilepsy and seizure disorder, so we're happy to do that. So epilepsy is a neurological condition that is simply defined as having recurring seizures. So anybody who has recurring seizures and is expected to continue to have seizures will receive a diagnosis of epilepsy. Oftentimes, people in the medical community will use the term seizure disorder. They are sort of interchangeable. It's the same thing. So anybody who has seizures, recurring seizures, has a diagnosis of epilepsy. A seizure is the presence of abnormal or excess electrical activity in your brain, and what your seizure looks like is dependent upon the part of your brain where that seizure activity or that excess electrical activity occurs. I have always felt like the best way to describe it for lay people is to think of your central nervous system as one very large electrical circuit, because our nervous system is just that, it's an electrical circuit. So anything that we say, do, all of our movements, all of our emotions, anything and everything in our bodies is controlled by our brain and our electrical circuits within our central nervous system. And so all of that can also be manifest in some sort of seizure activity. So it depends on what part of your brain is involved in the excess electrical activity, whether or not it's all of your brain, part of your brain. All of those things have an impact on what type of seizure you have, how long your seizure lasts, all of those kinds of things.
Thank you for that, because you know it obviously does cover a broad spectrum.
Yes, it does.
So is epilepsy a condition that impacts a lot of people?
Absolutely. Oftentimes many more people than I think people realize. Epilepsy affects 1 in 26 Americans, 65 million people worldwide, about 3 million Americans. In Pennsylvania, that translates to almost 200,000 people who have a diagnosis of epilepsy at some point in their life. right now, the Centers for Disease Control have a definition of active epilepsy, which means you are currently being treated for epilepsy, taking medication, and are expected to have a seizure at some point in the next year. So that doesn't necessarily include people who have very, very well-controlled epilepsy. Right now in Pennsylvania, that would include about 133,000 people. So many more people than folks realize sometimes. One of the other things I think is surprising about epilepsy in terms of who gets diagnosed right now is that a lot of older folks, senior citizens, are being diagnosed with epilepsy in the United States these days. In 2023, there was a study done, and over 500,000 seniors over 65 were diagnosed with epilepsy. And I think oftentimes people think of epilepsy as an early childhood condition and something that affects very young children, but really we see it affect people at any stage of life, because anything that harms your brain, affects your brain, causes infection, head injury, things like that can lead to some sort of seizure activity and some sort of epilepsy.
So you kind of covered, I was going to ask you whether it impacts children and adults, and clearly it does. But then
Absolutely.
back to, what causes it? So it sounds like there's also a broad range there. What types of things would cause someone to have epilepsy?
Well, I think the first thing to know is that we don't always know what causes epilepsy. And in many, many cases, we don't, which is part of the frustration with epilepsy. But we know that there are some childhood epilepsy syndromes and some genetic issues that will include epilepsy and seizure disorders and seizures as part of those syndromes. We know that head injury will lead to post-traumatic epilepsy. So for example, right now we see a lot of post-traumatic epilepsy in the veterans community and soldiers and folks who are exposed to a lot of concussion blasts and things of that nature. We see a lot of head injuries after car accidents, that kind of thing. Epilepsy might develop after a neurological infection, that kind of thing. So anything that can cause some sort of injury or insult to your brain, stroke, so those kinds of things, doctors will be able to pinpoint that as a cause for seizures. But there is a very, very large percentage of people who are having seizures and who have been diagnosed with epilepsy that we really don't know a specific cause for their seizures.
So can being around someone who has epilepsy cause someone to get it?
Not. Absolutely not. That's a very old time myth about epilepsy, but no, there's absolutely nothing contagious about epilepsy. So no.
Good to know.
Yeah.
However, I guess we could talk about potentially being around someone if there is a family member. Could it be hereditary?
There are some instances where heredity can play a role, and there are some families that see some genetic components to epilepsy. I think in the broad framework, that's a small percentage of people, but certainly if you are part of a family that sees epilepsy in your family, you're not going to consider that unusual. I don't think it's particularly unusual. Typically, I think that would be a particular type of epilepsy. So I think often at least in our work, we see that a fair amount with something called juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, where a youngster will start to have seizures. They'll receive treatment for the seizures, and they sort of quote unquote grow out of those seizures. So I have talked with many families where they'll say, my grandfather had those types of seizures, now my son's having those types of seizures, that kind of thing. But typically there's not necessarily a genetic component. And as I said, there are very specific genetic disorders that also epilepsy is a part of them. So things like Lennox-Gastaut, which is a pediatric epilepsy syndrome that's caused by, a genetic marker. Those kinds of things are obviously connected.
And when there are genetics involved, is it going to be every member of the family, every child, every generation?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, again, I don't think that that's particularly well understood. I think there's a lot of study going on in terms of trying to understand that. We just know that it does happen, so.
Okay. So if you don't mind, if we can pry a little further then into, we're talking about epilepsy, and epilepsy is the occurrence of seizures, but what is a seizure?
Sure. So the seizure itself is the presence of the electrical activity. So it's sort of like a power burst, sort of like a burst of excess electrical activity, or a short period of time when that balance of electrical activity is kind of out of whack. So the types of, there's actually more than 20 different types of seizures, clinical medical classifications of seizures. And I will share with you that the medical community has changed its official lingo around the titles and the classifications of seizures from time to time, and there can be hard to keep up with. But there are a couple that are probably the most typical that people are familiar with. One that probably you and I are most familiar with, that we probably grew up with the terminology, people call them grand mal seizures. In the medical world, they call them tonic-clonic seizures these days. And those are not necessarily the most common seizures, but people are most familiar with them, I think, because I call them the Hollywood seizures, because of the seizures that we see depicted most often in the media. So those are the type of seizures where a person will, first of all, their entire brain is involved in that excess electrical activity. It envelops their entire brain. So that will cause them to become stiff and rigid, probably fall to the ground. Oftentimes they will have convulsions, things like that. Those seizures tend to last 3-4 minutes, or somewhere in that range. So those are the types of seizures that people are most familiar with. But there are also seizures that are less sort of dramatic. There's something called an absence seizures that people used to call.
What will that look like? We're saying that the tonic-clonic looks like what we've seen on TV.
The
movement and those kind of things.
So an absence seizure, we used to call petit mal seizure, can be very fast. It can be very brief. In children, it's often mistaken for daydreaming. In an older adult, people might just think it's, grandpa kind of dozing off, that kind of thing. They can be 10 seconds, 15 seconds from start to finish. The person doesn't necessarily lose control. They aren't necessarily going to fall. They won't, there maybe will be some eye fluttering, that kind of thing. But unless you're really and truly kind of focused in on staring at that person, you may not even notice that they're not paying attention to you anymore. So they can be very, very, very fast, very hard to detect unless you're really watching for them.
Now, does that involve that momentary absence of consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they can be very dangerous, because that person, much like the person having a grand mal seizure or a tonic-clonic seizure, that person is completely unaware of their surroundings and what's happening. So they can be very, very dangerous depending upon what that person's doing at that particular moment that happens to them. Like if they're on the steps, or if they're on a ladder, or they're missing information, or heaven forbid they're driving a car, that kind of thing. I mean, 10 seconds, 10, 15 seconds can be a very long period of time, depending upon what you're doing. So, and then there's also Another type of seizure that's very common and is very often misunderstood for other types of things called a partial complex or a partial focal seizure that can look behavioral in nature. And that causes a lot of problems for folks, frankly, because it can be mistaken for somebody who is maybe intoxicated or maybe having some kind of an emotional or mental health episode. It can't, and the biggest problem with that is that people kind of try to interfere with a person who's having that kind of a seizure. So particularly if it's an adult. So if that happens and you happen to be in a, let's say in a convenience store, you might kind of start to look a little bit disoriented. So it's just every person who has a seizure is very different. Epilepsy is very much a spectrum disorder. Everybody's physical outward manifestation of their seizure is very unique to that individual person. So it just really depends on what is happening, what it actually looks like. But a complex partial seizure might involve lip smacking, eye fluttering, something that doctors call button picking, where a person might pull on their blouse or their shirt and look like they're picking at their buttons, even if they're like in a cotton t-shirt kind of thing, that sort of thing.
So,
Again, just
question on that, with the complex partial, is that person losing consciousness?
they are absolutely have no awareness of what's happening. Exactly. Yes, they are.
So even though they appear to be fully awake and potentially aware, they have no awareness at all that they're even doing these behaviors, right?
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
And again, can be really, can place the person who's having that kind of a seizure in a lot of danger because they're not aware. So, and in children, sometimes they will get up from their desk and be drawn to a window or a light, or they'll just get up and walk in circles and things like that. So, and with children, adults tend to be much more hands-on with children. So you're much more likely with a child to respond by sort of putting your hands on the child and saying, well, you need to sit, you need to get back in your desk, you need to get back in your chair. But if you do that with somebody who's having a complex partial seizure, their bodies react. They're not intentionally reacting because they don't have any awareness of what's happening. But they will react. And so that often causes problems, because then that, of course, is mistaken for inappropriate behavior. And so it's sometimes epilepsy is very, very complicated and very difficult to understand, and requires a lot of patience from the people around the person who's having a seizure.
So in those situations, you described 3 different types out of 20, apparently, different types of seizures. And in all of these cases, the person at least has momentary unconsciousness. So they're not at all aware. Is there any way that they can know it's going to happen, or what does that look like?
So there is a small percentage of patients who have something called an aura. And an aura is technically seizure activity because it's caused by excess electrical activity, but it serves many patients very well, because for many patients it serves as a warning system of sorts. So it might be a very significant taste in the person's mouth. I've had patients tell me that it's a really distinct queasiness that they feel in their stomach. It might be a really severe headache that comes on. I've had people tell me they have a light that they see, sort of like, if you squint your eyes really hard and you see that like light in your eyes, they get that kind of flash in their eyes. So those are things that are technically caused by excess electrical activity, but they serve as a warning system to patients that they are possibly going to have a stronger seizure or a seizure that's going to involve them losing awareness. So that's called an aura. And those patients are then able to remove themselves from whatever situation they're in that might pose a danger to them. You know, if they're home, maybe they can go lie down on their bed, or they can lie down on the floor. If they're in their office, maybe they can close their office door and lay down on the floor. Maybe ask a coworker for some help. If it's a youngster, maybe the youngster can alert the teacher, ask to go to the nurse's office. I mean, it just depends on what environment you're in. If it's a person who's driving a car, they can pull their car to the side of the road and make sure that they're in safety that way. So having an aura for many patients is sort of a backhanded blessing in disguise, I would say. But not all patients get an aura.
Okay. And
certainly.
So it's not everybody that gets it. And it sounds
Correct.
like while it's all part of this kind of excess electricity in the brain, the aura, the person remains aware that they're
Correct.
fully
During the
aware
period
of whatever
yeah.
that sensation is.
Yes.
And that sensation can come before something that causes them to lose consciousness and awareness.
Correct. Correct. That is correct.
Now, if we can touch on, you mentioned if somebody has this sensation and they're driving, they can pull over. So
Yes.
let's talk about the implications of driving and epilepsy and how that factors into it. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's rough. So every state has a different set of regulations about driving and epilepsy. Obviously, if someone's having active seizures, they shouldn't drive, and they should talk with their doctor about when it is safe for them to drive. In Pennsylvania, you should be seizure-free for at least 6 months in order to be eligible to drive. That's what our Pennsylvania regulations say. And in Pennsylvania, anytime somebody has any sort of unexplained lapse of consciousness, a physician is required by law to report that to the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation.
Okay.
So when physicians are trained in that, of course, seizure is the example that they use. So every doctor in the world knows that if someone has a seizure, they're supposed to report that to the Department of Transportation. So, but there are some exceptions to that regulation. One of them is, in fact, if a patient has a significant history of an aura, and that's defined as 2 minutes, that your aura has to last for at least 2 minutes, and that your history has to be medically documented to have been at least 2 years. So your physician has to say, I've been treating this patient for a while, and we've been talking about this for 2 years. I know that he's had these auras for at least 2 years. So even if you're having seizures, if you have that kind of an aura and you can safely, pull your car to the side and not have a seizure while you're driving, the Department of Transportation will not suspend your license. If you only have seizures when you're sleeping, which is the case for some folks, that they only have seizures during those changes in sleep, there's no need to suspend your driver's license. And the third situation is if your physician is trying to make sure that you're not taking any more medication than you absolutely have to, and they're titrating your medication down, and you happen to have a breakthrough seizure, and they know that if they put your medication right back to where it was the last time to increase that dose again, then the Department of Transportation won't suspend your driver's license. Other than that, if you're having any kind of seizure activity at all, you should probably not drive at all, and you should definitely be working with your physician to figure out under what conditions you should drive, and when it should be safe for you to drive, and all of that kind of thing, even if it's been 6 months since you've had a seizure.
So driving alone, there are pros and cons there, because there are challenges. Obviously, you just
Absolutely.
talked about for the safety of the general public, there's a rule that you have to be seizure-free for, you said 6 months, is that right?
Yes,
Okay. And that is not only for the protection of the individual themselves, but anyone around them, I would,
correct.
yes.
Yes, correct.
But then we talked about, you mentioned there are the titrating medication only during sleep or documented known aura that would allow you to be safe and
Correct.
be off the road.
Correct.
So that's good, but I suppose the flip side of that whole thing is now someone who does not qualify under one of those three situations is unable to drive. So we're looking at how are they getting to their doctor to document
Correct.
these things?
Correct.
How are they getting to work? Talk a little bit about those things.
It's a challenge. It's very, very difficult, especially in a state like Pennsylvania. I think the onset and the creation of things like Uber and Lyft have helped a little bit, but those things are expensive. So that's tough. But Pennsylvania doesn't exactly have, it's not exactly the mecca of public transportation. So it's very limited in terms of what your options are for employment. It's very limiting in terms of your social options and where you can shop and where you can go to socialize with friends and family and things like that. And it really makes you kind of dependent upon other people for where you're going to go, how you're going to get there. You're always kind of looking for somebody else to give you a ride, that kind of thing. So it's really isolating for many adults, particularly young adults, I think, to figure all those things out. It's hard. It's rough.
And to make things not as rough, let's talk a little bit about if I'm around someone who experiences a seizure, how
Yeah.
can I help that individual?
So chances are you'll be around somebody who has a seizure, because 1 in 10 people are going to have a seizure in their lifetime. So because of a head injury, because of an accident, because of an allergic reaction to a medication, that kind of thing. So if you're around somebody who has a tonic-clonic seizure, the most important thing is to stay calm, which I know is easy for me to say, but it's a little unnerving to be with somebody who's having a seizure. But believe me when I tell you, everybody in the environment will be very happy if you're the person who stays calm. There's not a ton that you can do for the person, but you can stay calm. You can be reassuring. You can move things in the environment around so that you can protect them from getting injured in some other way because they're having a seizure. You can do something to protect their head. You can take your sweatshirt off, your jacket off, roll it up, put it under their head. You can roll them to their side. It doesn't matter which side, just rolling them onto their side keeps their airway open, which is very, very helpful. You can time the seizure. You don't want anybody to have a tonic-clonic or a grand mal seizure that goes on for more than 5 minutes. So even if you know that that person is a person who has epilepsy, if it goes on for more than 5 minutes, they should be evaluated by a medical professional. So I would encourage you to get some help, call an ENT, that kind of thing. Don't ever put anything in someone's mouth when they're having a seizure. It's one of the big myths that kind of persists out there. It's not good for the person. It's not good for you. Don't ever try to like hold a person down. You can't stop a seizure once it starts. There are folks that think you can. So you can't stop a seizure once it starts. Don't ever put anything in anybody's mouth. I know there's probably folks out there that have heard or, again, seen in movies and that kind of thing. Don't put a wallet in anybody's mouth. Don't put a pencil in anybody's mouth. Don't put a tongue depressor in anybody's mouth. Those things can all break off and actually cause injury to the person who's having a seizure. And if your hand or your fingers get caught in the person's mouth, they're going to be in that person's mouth until that seizure stops. And there's nothing you can do about that. So again, not good for you, not good for the person who's having a seizure. So Don't ever put anything in anybody's mouth if they're having a seizure, regardless of what kind of seizure they're having. Once that seizure starts to subside, that person will be probably pretty disoriented for the most part. Typically, people are very, very tired. Oftentimes, people need to sleep after they've had that type of a seizure. We tell people not to give them anything to drink, not to give them anything to eat. Oftentimes people think they need to like run and go get medication for people. You can't stop somebody's seizure because you decided to find their regular medication and give it to them. That's not going to stop their seizure. Some people do have a rescue medication, but unless you really have been trained in how to use that rescue medication, it's not something you should try to do. Again, the biggest thing you can do is just try to protect their head, turn them on their side, keep their airway open, and just be calm and reassuring for them. Make sure they know as they start to kind of come around that they just tell them they've had a seizure and kind of help them regain orientation after they're regaining awareness, that kind of thing.
So
really
big no-nos, you're not going to do anything to them to stop it. You're not going to put anything in their mouth. You can keep them safe by making the area around them safe.
Yes.
And if I heard correctly, 5 minutes is too long.
Yes.
That's when you definitely want medical intervention. But I suppose if somebody began a seizure immediately now, if you don't know if they have a history,
right.
Are you calling 911 right away? Are you waiting to see if you have to call?
There are some circumstances in which you want to call 911 right away. One is if you don't know if the person has a history, because if you don't know, then you sort of have to assume it's a first seizure. Okay. So if you don't know if a person has a history of epilepsy, then I would say err on the side of thinking it's a first seizure, and that person, you don't know why that person's having a seizure, so they need to be medically evaluated. So if you think it's a first seizure, certainly if the person is pregnant, if the person is a person with diabetes, they need to be evaluated. Anytime anybody has a seizure anywhere in or around water, I don't care, like it doesn't matter if it was like a 10-second seizure or a 10-minute seizure, in or anywhere near water, that person needs to be medically evaluated. So under those kinds of situations, you need to call 911 right away, regardless of what else is going on or whether or not you think they do or don't have a history of epilepsy. So and anytime the seizure goes on for more than 5 minutes. If it's somebody that you know has a history of epilepsy, you know they typically have seizures that last for like 2 or 3 minutes, which can be a really long time when you're the person who's with someone who's having a seizure, tonic-clonic or a grand mal seizure. There's really no reason for them to have to go to the emergency room. They're probably not going to want to go to the emergency room. Sometimes it's expensive for them to go to the emergency room, that kind of thing. But again, pregnancy, the person's diabetic, if they've been around water, or if it seems to go on for more than 5 minutes, then definitely call 911 and get some help.
Good pointers, good framework for that. Appreciate that. So now let's turn to what does the Epilepsy Association of Western and Central Pennsylvania do to support individuals like this?
Sure. So we try to be as helpful as we can to do whatever we can to sort of mitigate the negative consequences of having seizures. I often say to people, trying to be good friends, we as Americans are sort of socialized to say, gosh, you're in crisis. What can I do to help? If there's something I can do, please let me know. That's sort of our philosophy and our approach at the Epilepsy Association. So we have, over the years, gone to parents and to individuals who live with seizures and said that and asked them to tell us what it is they need and what they want. So as a result of that, we have a whole list of things that we do for folks. Obviously, we do a lot of education and outreach and awareness kinds of things. But in addition to that, we have supportive things that we do that are, some are short term, some are longer term, but a lot of the short term things that we do are things like emergency medication assistance if folks have lost their insurance, can't afford to pay their co-payment. Older citizens sometimes get dumped into that donut hole. For a while, there was a donut hole with medical assistance, or Medicare, that kind of thing. So if somebody is having trouble accessing healthcare services, we try to help with things like that. We have a program for folks who need nursing services because the person who's the primary caregiver for somebody who has seizures that are uncontrolled just needs some respite, and there's nobody in their family that can give them a break. So we have a respite care program. We have a program to provide movement monitors to folks who have seizures at night, and especially with young children, we often talk to parents who will literally take turns watching their kids sleep because they're so fearful about what will happen if their child has a seizure at night. So we have a program that actually pays for movement monitors so that those parents can try to get some sleep. So that's the kind of thing we do short term. Then we have some programs that are kind of longer term that are geared towards helping people be more independent and achieve some of their longer term goals. So that might be things like our high school scholarship program. We have a program called the Oscar Project that places service dogs with folks who have epilepsy to help them hopefully live independently, get back to work, things like that. So we are really trying to figure out what is it that we can do that we can help you continue to live as independently as possible and still deal with the fact that you're having epilepsy. So maybe you're still having seizures. That's not a great thing, but how can you continue to pursue your dreams and live life without compromise despite the fact that you're having seizures? So we also do a lot of social programs that hopefully promote some networking and some peer support with folks. So that
What about, I'm sorry, I was going to say, children, are there school programs?
Yes, we do a lot of programs in the schools. A lot of the things we do in the schools revolve around training for school personnel and students so that it creates a safer environment for the kids who are having seizures, training for teachers on seizure response, school nurses. We help with developing IEPs and educational programs for kids who are having seizures. We'll also do classroom presentations so that hopefully children will not grow up believing some of the myths and the stigma that's still associated with epilepsy and seizures.
That's awesome.
So yeah, so that's a big program. We do that a lot.
And what about in the adult world? Do
Yeah,
you do training of other?
We do. I was just going to say we do training for other programs as well. So we will do that in community programs, residential providers, for example. I did training for a Rotary Club last week, for example, or sports teams, things like that. So we will go into an employer and do seizure recognition and first aid training for somebody if they're having seizures and their seizures are active and they're in a new job, or maybe they're having seizures again for the first time in a while, or they've been transferred to a new division, that kind of thing, and they just want the folks in their environment to know what to do if they should have a seizure. We can come in and talk with the employees and that kind of thing and let them know what to do if someone should have a seizure. So
that's truly helpful. It really is.
Yeah.
I don't want to run out of time without you mentioning Camp Frog. Tell me about that.
Oh, yeah. Camp Frog is everybody's favorite. Camp Frog is a summer program for children who have epilepsy and is summer camp program. It's a week long. We integrate our kids with other kids who just happen to be at camp. Essentially, we go to an existing YMCA program that works with us. They are great. And we take medical supports and additional counselors and place them into the YMCA camp program. So there's really nothing, it really doesn't have anything to do with epilepsy. It's just camp. It's just kids going to camp. And so we take a pediatric neurologist and a nurse from Children's Hospital with us. One of my staff go there for the week, and we take additional counselors with us. So we might put, depending upon the seizure profile and the ages of the kids that actually come and that kind of thing, we might put 1 or 2 children who are part of the Camp Frog group, just get assigned to a cabin with 8 or 10 kids that happen, depending upon the size of the cabin, who just happen to be at camp that week.
Okay.
And so they camp, mom and dad don't have to worry about their child being at camp and whether or not they'll be okay if they happen to have a seizure. And the extra counselors are there if somebody gets a little extra tired or does happen to have a seizure. And so we do all kinds of training with all of the staff in the camp environment. But if somebody does have a seizure, then their pediatric neurologist is there to immediately do an evaluation, and the nurse is there and she manages everybody's medications and all of that stuff. So all of the medical supports are there, and the kids come and go and get their medications, but mostly they're just horseback riding and swimming and doing arts and crafts
Kid
and
stuff.
yeah, doing all that stuff you do when you go to overnight camp,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I want to take a moment to share your contact information with everyone, because if anyone is seeing this and says, hey, I need something, I'd like them to know how to get in touch with you. So Peggy is with the Epilepsy Association of Western and Central Pennsylvania. And I'll just note, as indicated, you are serving a broad area. You serve 49 counties, is that right?
We serve 49 counties in Western and Central Pennsylvania, although anybody who wants to participate in our programs, we have very few programs that are not open to folks. And I would add that we were also a part of the Epilepsy Alliance America. So if there's somebody listening who isn't in Pennsylvania or isn't part of Western or Central Pennsylvania that is looking for local supports and services, they should go ahead and contact us and contact me, and we'll help them find somebody in their area that does similar kinds of local supports and services as well.
That's amazing. So when you do want to reach out, you should know you can call the office at 412-322-5880 or visit the website at www.eawcp.org. I will also share my contact information for anybody who needs to reach out to Outspoken. I am Christine at outspoken.info. You can call my office at 412-346-0292.